The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of gray, drizzly morning that makes all of southern Ontario feel like it's holding its breath. I was standing in my kitchen in Oakville, making oatmeal I probably wouldn't finish, when my son's name lit up my phone. My heart did that small, hopeful leap it still does, every time he calls, even now, even after everything. "Mom," he said. His voice had that careful, rehearsed quality I hadn't heard since he was 17 and had backed my car into the neighbor's fence. "I have something to tell you. I've been seeing someone. Her name is Celeste. And Mom, I think she might be the one." I set down my wooden spoon. The oatmeal was starting to stick to the pot. "How long?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "About 7 months." 7 months. My only child had been in a serious relationship for 7 months, and this was the first I was hearing about it. But I pushed that thought down where I keep the other things I'm not ready to examine, and I said what any mother says. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I can't wait to meet her." That night I lay in bed and listened to the November rain against the windows and thought about my husband, Gerald. He'd been gone for 3 years. Pancreatic cancer, which doesn't give you much time to prepare. He was 64. We'd been married 31 years. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes after a long marriage ends. Not just missing the person, but missing who you are when they're beside you. I'd been slowly, carefully rebuilding myself, learning to go to the farmer's market alone, cooking for one, getting used to the quiet. My son was 34, an environmental engineer, kind and careful the way his father was. I had been so worried about him after Gerald died, worried he was closing himself off, working too hard, forgetting to build a life. So the news of Celeste should have felt like relief. It mostly did. The rest of it I ignored. She came to dinner that first Friday in November. I spent 2 days cooking. Split pea soup with ham hock, the recipe Gerald's mother taught me when we were newly married. Butter tarts for dessert, proper ones with runny centers, because my son had requested them every Christmas since he was 6 years old. I polished the good wine glasses. I wore the dark green blouse Gerald always said made me look like myself. The doorbell rang at 6:30 exactly. Celeste was beautiful in the way of someone who knows it. Not vain, exactly, but accustomed. She wore heels to a home dinner, which struck me only because the driveway is uneven and I always mean to have it fixed. She had her mother with her. No one had mentioned her mother would be coming. "This is Vivian," my son said, in a tone that meant he'd been told last minute himself. Vivienne shook my hand with both of hers, a politician's handshake, and looked past my shoulder into the hallway with the frank, appraising eye of someone calculating square footage. "What a lovely home," she said. "You've kept it beautifully for one person." I thanked her. I took their coats. I served the soup. Celeste ate 3 spoonfuls and pushed the bowl aside. She was gluten-free, she mentioned, though split pea soup has never contained gluten in its life. She spent most of dinner on her phone, which she left face up on the table, and when she did speak, it was to ask questions about my pension, about the neighborhood property values, about whether I found the house difficult to manage alone at my age. At my age. I was 66. Vivienne was more subtle. She waited until the butter tarts to ask about Gerald's work history. He'd been with the same engineering firm for 28 years, she noted. Had I found all his paperwork in order after he passed? These things could get complicated, she said pleasantly, pouring herself more wine, especially with pensions, with benefits, with assets people don't always know to look for. I said everything had been handled by our lawyer. Vivienne nodded and smiled and changed the subject. After they left, I stood at the sink washing up and thought, something is wrong here. Not with Celeste's manners, not with the questions themselves. People ask clumsy questions. Something else. Something in the way Vivienne's eyes had moved around my living room. Something in the way Celeste had looked at my son when he talked about Gerald. A quick measuring look. Recalibrating. I called my oldest friend, Harriet. We've been friends since our kids were in the same kindergarten class in Burlington. She answered on the second ring because she always does. How was it? She asked. I don't know, I said, and I told her everything, including the part I'd almost talked myself out of. And Harriet, who has known me longer than almost anyone alive, said, trust that. The engagement was announced 4 months later. February, the kind of cold that makes your car complain about starting. My son called, excited in a way that sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. She said yes, he told me. We're thinking September. I said congratulations. I meant it, or tried to. What followed was 6 months of watching my son disappear by degrees. He stopped calling as often. When he did, the conversations had a new shape to them, shorter, careful, like he was speaking from a script he hadn't quite memorized. He'd started saying things in Celeste's cadences, things like, Mom, you should really think about downsizing. That house is a lot for one person to keep up. And Celeste knows a financial advisor who specializes in estate planning for seniors. Not elderly, just seniors. I was 66. The wedding was in September at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I'd offered to help plan. Celeste had smiled her careful smile and said they had a coordinator. I'd offered to make the cake. I've made every significant cake in my family for 40 years. And I'm not modest about it. I'm good. Celeste laughed, not unkindly, and said they booked someone in Toronto. Apparently a home-baked cake read as, and here she paused just long enough to choose the word, informal. I bought a dress I loved. Dusty rose, 3/4 sleeves, the kind of thing that looks like you tried without looking like you tried. I was seated in the 5th row. Vivienne was in the 2nd row. I found out when I arrived and was handed my seating card by a young woman with a clipboard who had the grace to look briefly uncertain. I stood there for a moment looking at the card, in my dusty rose dress, holding my clutch, and thought of all the things I will not say to a clipboard. Then I found my seat. From the 5th row I could see the back of my son's head. I couldn't see his face when he cried, and I know he cried because I know him, because Vivienne was seated close enough to touch his arm, which she did, and I was seated behind people I'd never met. At the reception, I was at table 11. Vivienne sat at the head table. There was a moment during toasts when someone called for the groom's mother. Celeste looked around the room from me with the expression of someone who has misplaced a set of keys. Oh, of course, she said into the microphone. My mother-in-law would like to say a few words. She made a small gesture toward the back of the room. I walked to the microphone on steady legs. I said what you say. I said I was grateful for the day. I said Gerald would have been so proud. I said that watching my son become the man he was had been the privilege of my life. And then Celeste started applauding. Quick, sharp claps, the kind that end speeches, and others joined in, and I walked back to table 11 and sat down and folded my hands in my lap and did not let my face do anything I would regret. I drove home at 10:30. I didn't say goodbye to my son because I couldn't find him in the crowd and I wasn't going to go looking. In the parking lot, I heard Celeste talking to one of her bridesmaids. Her voice carries more than she knows. She's harmless, Celeste was saying. She just doesn't have anything, really. Gerald was just a salaried employee. There's the house, I suppose, but these days that's not exactly. I didn't hear the rest. I was already in my car. For the next 4 weeks, my son didn't call. I called him 3 times. He answered twice, both times distracted, both times with a noise in the background that meant Celeste was in the room. "Yeah, Mom, sorry, it's been crazy. We're still unpacking. I'll call you back tonight." He never called back tonight. He never called back. I baked maple walnut squares and drove to their new townhouse in Mississauga, a glass and steel building that looked like it was trying to apologize for existing. I found the unit number, knocked. Celeste opened the door in a silk robe, hair perfect, and looked at me the way you look at a courier who's arrived at the wrong address. "He's in a meeting," she said. She took the container of squares without looking inside. "I'll let him know you stopped by." The door closed. I made it to the elevator before my eyes started burning. I stood in the lobby for a moment until I was sure I could drive. That night I called Harriet. She closed the door in my face, I said. "I know, honey," Harriet said, and I could hear her putting down whatever she was doing. "Tell me everything." I hadn't cried since the wedding. I cried now, the kind of crying that goes back further than the immediate cause. 3 years of widowhood, 6 months of watching my son pull away, the 5th row, table 11, the parking lot, the closed door, all of it at once. When I was done, Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember what Gerald told you before he went into the hospital? The last time he was really himself?" I remembered. He'd been sitting up in bed at home. We'd set up a hospital bed in the study, which Gerald pretended to hate and secretly appreciated because the view from that window was better. He'd been lucid, one of the good days. He held my hand and said, "Ruthie, there are some things I haven't told you yet, when I'm gone." And he held up his hand because I'd started to object. "When I'm gone, call Leonard Marsh. He has instructions. He'll explain everything. Promise me you won't let anyone talk you out of anything before you call Leonard." I'd made the promise and then not kept it immediately because I'd been too busy not falling apart, and then I'd forgotten, and then a year had passed, and Leonard Marsh's business card had stayed in the kitchen junk drawer under expired coupons and a broken watch band. I went to the drawer. I found the card. The next morning, I called Leonard Marsh. He was Gerald's lawyer, a quiet, meticulous man in his late 60s who I'd met twice at firm events. He didn't sound surprised to hear from me. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I wondered when you'd call. Are you free Thursday?" His office was in downtown Hamilton, 15th floor, view of the harbor. He brought coffee without asking how I took it, which meant Gerald had told him. He set a large envelope on the desk between us. "Gerald asked me to hold this until you were ready," he said. He was particular about the wording, ready. He said you'd know when that was. I opened the envelope. Inside was a deed. A commercial property, 3 connected storefronts and an apartment above on a main street in Elora, Ontario. Gerald had inherited it from his uncle, who'd run a hardware store there for 40 years. The uncle had died 4 years before Gerald. I remembered the funeral vaguely. A long drive, a small church, potato salad in a church basement. Gerald had been quiet driving home. I'd assumed grief. I kept reading. The property had been rented to a bakery, a bookshop, and a physiotherapy clinic. The apartment above was occupied. All leases were current, managed by a property management company Gerald had arranged. The most recent appraisal, dated 18 months ago, $2.8 million. There was a letter in Gerald's handwriting. Ruth, if you're reading this, I'm not there and I'm sorry for that, more than I can say in a letter. Uncle Warren left me the Elora property because he had no one else, and I didn't tell you right away because I wanted to think about how to do it right. Then time passed, and I realized I'd been putting it off for the same reason I put off a lot of things. I didn't want to change what we had. What we had was real and clean and ours, and I didn't want money in it. But here's what I know about the world, Ruth. People are different when they know. I've seen it. Good people, people who love someone, they change. They start calculating. They start feeling entitled to things. I never wanted you to be loved for anything except yourself. Leonard has everything in order. The property is yours. The income is yours. The decisions are yours. I set it up so nothing can be touched without your signature, and your signature alone. Protect yourself. I love you. I will always love you. Gerald. I sat in Leonard Marsh's office for a long time. The harbor light came through the window. How much income? I finally asked. Between the 3 commercial rents and the apartment, Leonard said carefully, approximately $94,000 a year. It's been going into a separate account. He slid a bank statement across the desk. There were 3 years of deposits. I drove home and called Harriet. She came over with groceries and a bottle of wine and read every document twice. Ruthie, she said, using the name only she and Gerald had ever used. Do you understand what this means? It means Gerald was smarter than me. It means you're not a widow with a pension and a house, Harriet said. It means you have options, real ones. I thought about Vivienne asking about Gerald's benefits, about Celeste listening to my son describe his childhood with that careful cataloging attention, about the financial advisor who specializes in seniors. If they'd known, I said, they would have been so much better at pretending to love you, Harriet said, and you might never have seen what was real. The call from my son came 2 weeks later. He sounded different, warmer, the way he gets when he wants something, a tone I hadn't heard since he was asking to borrow the car in high school. Mom, he said, Celeste and I have been really thinking about you. We've been worried, honestly. The house, all that space, all that upkeep, you shouldn't have to manage that alone. I kept my voice neutral. I'm managing fine. There's this place, he said, in Burlington near the lake. Celeste looked it up. Heritage Point. It's not like it's gorgeous, actually. More like a condo community. They have a pool. They have activities. A retirement residence, I said. It's not like that. He was backpedaling already. It's independent living. Very active. People your age who want community. I'm 66, I said. I know. But Mom, he exhaled. We've been talking to someone. A financial advisor who can look at the whole picture. Where the money goes, what makes the most sense long term. He could just sit down with you, explain some options. What's his name? I asked. His name is Barrett. He's done a lot of work with, he hesitated, with families in situations like ours. Situations like ours. I wrote that down on the back of an envelope. After we hung up, I called Leonard Marsh. Then I called Harriet. Then I looked up the name Barrett in connection with retirement planning and elder law in the GTA and found 3 complaints filed with FSSRA, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, in the past 4 years. 2 had been settled out of court, the third was still pending. Leonard referred me to a colleague, an elder law specialist named Dr. Helen Ewan, 22 years of practice, sharp as a thumbtack. She met me at her office in Burlington on a Wednesday morning and listened to everything without writing anything down, which meant she was doing it all in her head. "What you're describing," she said when I'd finished, "follows a pattern we see with some regularity. It starts with isolation, limiting the parent's relationship with the adult child. Then comes the undermining. You can't manage, you need help. You're too old for this. Then urgency. Then documents." "Has my son filed anything?" I asked. "Not yet, but you should act before he does." She pulled a legal pad from her drawer and began to write. "First, we protect the Alora property in an irrevocable trust. Done correctly, this means no power of attorney, no court order. Nothing can touch it without triggering a legal process you control. Second, we get a capacity assessment done, not because there's any question, but because we want the documentation to exist. Third," she paused. "Third, we need to find out how much your daughter-in-law knows and how she came to know it." That's when she told me what she'd already found. Celeste had a history. Not criminal, careful. Always just inside the legal lines. 2 previous relationships with men whose mothers had significant assets. Both relationships had ended badly for the mothers. In one case, an elderly woman in Kitchener had signed over power of attorney and spent 14 months trying to reverse it. The case had been settled privately. Celeste's name appeared in the initial statement, then disappeared from all subsequent filings. "She knows how to do this," I said. "She's done it before," Helen confirmed, "which means she also knows the exit. She won't expose herself, but she needs the signatures before she can leave." I went home and cooked dinner and sat at Gerald's end of the table and talked to him the way I sometimes do when no one's watching. "I think you knew," I told him, "about Celeste or someone like her. I think you put everything in that envelope and told Leonard to wait because you were protecting me from something that hadn't happened yet." The property management on the Alora buildings sent the quarterly report. The bookshop had renewed their lease. The physiotherapy clinic was expanding into the adjacent space. I had more money coming in every month than Celeste made in salary, and the only people who knew were a lawyer, an old friend, and a dead man. My son called that Saturday and asked if I'd thought more about meeting Barrett. I said I had. I said I was actually interested in discussing financial planning, that he was right, I should think about the future. I said maybe they could come to the house. He sounded so relieved it hurt. Saturday, 2 weeks later, Helen Ewan arrived first and positioned herself in the kitchen with a clear sightline to the living room. Harriet sat in the garden room with her coffee and her reading glasses, visible but unobtrusive. I'd invested in a small digital recorder, which is legal in Ontario when you are a party to the conversation. My son arrived with Celeste and a man I hadn't met, Barrett, who was younger than I expected, mid-40s, excellent shoes, the kind of firm handshake that announces itself as confident rather than expressing it. He set up an iPad on my coffee table with the ease of someone who has done this many times. He spent the first 10 minutes on flattery. What a lovely home. These heritage neighborhoods hold their value so well. You've kept it beautifully. I noticed him clocking the artwork, the shelving, the furniture, calculating the way Vivienne had done that first November. "Mrs. Calloway," he said finally, "I've done a preliminary look at your public records. Your home is currently assessed at approximately $680,000. With the current market in Oakville, I'd estimate you could clear close to $700 after costs. He opened a spreadsheet on the iPad and turned it toward me. If we structure that correctly and direct the funds into a managed account, he glanced at my son, with appropriate co-signatories to ensure everything runs smoothly. Co-signatories, I said. Just a safeguard, Celeste said, so you're not managing everything alone. I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. I said, I appreciate the concern. Can I ask, what does managed account mean practically? Who has access? Barra smiled. As your appointed trustees, your son and daughter-in-law would work with my firm. To control my money, I said. To manage your assets, he said, for your protection. He reached into his briefcase and produced a document. The font was small. I could see my name pre-filled on several lines. This is a lot to read right now, I said. I'd like to take this to my own lawyer before I sign anything. The room changed. Celeste's expression didn't move exactly, but something behind it did. Of course, she said. Completely understandable. Though I'll be honest, these planning windows close. Barrett's client roster fills up. If we want to secure a spot at Heritage Point, you've already looked into Heritage Point. We thought it would be useful to have the information, my son said, without asking me. He looked up finally. Mom, we're trying to help. I looked at my son. I looked at this man I had carried and nursed and worried over and driven to hockey practice in the dark and sat beside in hospital waiting rooms when Gerald was dying. I looked at his face, guilty, uncomfortable, convinced he was doing the right thing, and felt something crack open in my chest. I need a moment, I said. Excuse me. I went to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my wrists, something my grandmother taught me for moments when you need to stay controlled. I cracked the door. She's more resistant than I expected, Barrett was saying. She's stubborn, Celeste said. It's fine. We expected this. If she won't sign today, my son's voice. Then we moved to the secondary option. Celeste's voice was level, professional. There are grounds for a capacity application. We document a pattern, missed bills, confusion about finances. Barrett can provide an expert assessment. She's not incapacitated. She doesn't need to be incapacitated, Celeste said. She needs to appear questionable. It's a low bar legally, and once it's filed, she'll be managing it from a position of defense rather than offense. There was a silence. My son said, I don't know about that. You love her, Celeste said, and her voice was different now, softer, strategic. We're doing this for her. You know what happens to women like her when they're managing everything alone. You've seen the stories. We're protecting her. I flushed the toilet. I ran the tap. I walked back into my living room. Sit down, I said. Something in my voice made them sit. I am going to ask you something, and I would like an honest answer. I looked at my son. Do you believe, genuinely believe, that I am unable to manage my own life? Mom. Yes or no? He looked at Celeste, then back at me. He said, no. Then I want you to listen very carefully. I picked up my phone from the arm of the chair where I'd set it at the start. I've been recording this conversation, which is my legal right under Ontario law since I am a party to it. I played 30 seconds of Celeste's voice discussing the capacity application. My son went very still. Helen Ewan walked in from the kitchen. I'm Dr. Helen Ewan, she said pleasantly. I'm Mrs. Calloway's elder law counsel. She extended a card to Barrett, who didn't take it. I'd had the opportunity to review the documents you brought today, and I have some concerns I'd like to discuss. For instance, the co-signatory language in Clause 4, combined with the asset transfer provision in Clause 9, would effectively strip Mrs. Calloway of independent control over all listed assets, with no meaningful reversal mechanism. Barrett stood up. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," Helen said. "Please sit down." He sat. She walked him through every document. She did it methodically, quietly, the way someone does when they've done it many times and have stopped needing to perform. Barrett's composure eroded slowly. By the end, he was talking about his firm's compliance record, which no one had asked about. Celeste had gone very quiet. My son was white. At a certain point, Harriet came in from the garden room and put her hand on my shoulder, which was exactly the right thing to do at that moment and nothing else. After Barrett left, quickly briefcase already snapped shut before he was fully out of his chair, and after Helen had finished her documentation, my son and I were alone in my living room for the first time in months. He couldn't look at me. "She told me you were struggling," he said finally. "She had examples. Bills you'd supposedly forgotten, a phone call where you got confused about dates." I believed her. "When did she start?" He thought about it. "About a month after the wedding. Little things. A worry here, a concern there. And she was so—" He stopped. "She seemed so genuinely worried about you. She seemed to care about you more than you cared about yourself." "That's how it works," I said. He put his face in his hands. I sat across from him, not beside him. Across. There was still a distance between us that I didn't have the energy to pretend wasn't there. "How much did you know?" I asked. "About the capacity application, about the plan." "Not all of it," he said. "I didn't know about Barrett's record. I didn't know about the specifics of what she said while you were in the bathroom. I thought we were helping you plan." "But Mom—" He looked up. I knew something felt wrong. I knew it, and I kept going. "Yes," I said, "you did." We sat with that for a while. He stayed in the guest room that night and the night after. On the third morning, he came downstairs while I was making porridge and asked if he could have some, and we ate together without talking. And it was the most honest thing we'd done in almost a year. Helen filed for an annulment on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. Leonard Marsh completed the Allura Trust within the week. I had a cognitive capacity assessment done by Gerald's old family doctor, who was mildly affronted that it was even necessary. The results went to Helen's office, dated and certified. 2 months later, Celeste called. I almost didn't answer. She was direct, which I'll give her. She wanted a financial settlement in exchange for an uncontested annulment and a signed non-disclosure agreement. She named a number. I told her to speak to my lawyer. There were 3 more calls over the next month. Vivian twice, Celeste once more. Each time I said the same thing. "My lawyer's contact information is in your file." Harriet said, "You're very calm about this." "I'm not calm," I said. "I'm just past the point where she can reach me." The Allura property I'd been sitting on for 3 years. Gerald had imagined I would visit, had written in his letter that he thought I would love it there. I hadn't been ready. Now I drove out on a Saturday in late November, just me, just my car. The main street was quiet in the way of a small town on a cold morning. I found the address. 3 storefronts, dark red brick, a bookshop and a bakery and a physiotherapy clinic. Windows lit warm against the gray day. The apartment upstairs had a small balcony. There were window boxes that had been put to sleep for winter. The property manager, a matter-of-fact woman named Gwen, who had been handling the buildings for 6 years, walked me through everything. The tenants knew Gerald by name. The baker had put a photograph of Gerald and his uncle in the back of the shop, which I wasn't prepared for. I stood in front of that photograph for a long time. On the drive home, I called my son. I told him about the property. I told him about the trust, the income, the account with 3 years of deposits. He was silent for a long moment. Dad knew this might happen, he said finally. He knew someone might try, I said. I don't think he knew it would be someone you chose. I'm sorry, Mom. He'd said it many times since the living room. This time it sounded less like a request and more like something he was saying, because it was true and would remain true, regardless of whether I acknowledged it. You can be sorry, I told him. But sorry is the beginning, not the end. He's been coming to Oakville every other Sunday. He does the things that need doing, the Evistros, the storm windows, the things Gerald used to do, and then we have dinner, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we just watch television. And it's not what it was before, but it might be becoming something else, something that knows its own weight. Helen referred my case to a network of elder law organizations across Ontario. 2 of them were interested in my story. Not the dramatic version, but the specific version, the one with dates and documents, and the name Barrett and the paper trail at FSSRA. There are other families. There are other women sitting in 5th rows. I spoke at a legal clinic in Hamilton in February. I wore the dusty rose dress because I liked it, and not wearing it wouldn't change what had happened. 11 women in the room, ages ranging from 62 to 81. 3 of them were there because a child had already started the process. The financial advisor, the documents, the quiet strategic concern. I told them about Gerald's letter, about how he'd said they would know who loved them for who they were. I told them the silence can be the smartest thing in the room. After, a woman about my age came up to me. She had the look of someone who has been told to be grateful for things she should not have had to tolerate. My son is exactly like what you described, she said. I thought I was imagining it. I thought I was the problem. You're not imagining it, I said, and you're not the problem. Those 2 things are worth writing down somewhere. She started to cry, which made me hold her hand, and I thought about Gerald saying I was stronger than I knew, and I thought that he was right, but that the strength he meant was not something I had possessed quietly all along. It was something I had been forced to build, piece by piece. In the 5th row, at table 11, in the parking lot, at the closed door, in Leonard Marsh's office with a harbor view and a letter in a familiar hand. I'm 67 now. The Allura lease renewals came in March, all 3 tenants staying, the bakery asking about the unit next door. Gwen says the bookshop owner wants to name a reading corner after Gerald, which I told her yes to without needing to think about it. My son and his girlfriend, a thoughtful woman who teaches high school English and looked me in the eye the first time we met, are coming for Thanksgiving. He asked if he could help cook. I said yes, and then I said, "You can make the butter tarts. Your grandmother's recipe is in the blue binder." He said he didn't know there was a blue binder. "There are a lot of things you didn't know," I said. "That's what we're fixing." Gerald once told me that the most powerful thing a person can do is nothing. To stay quiet, to hold on, to wait until the truth doesn't need your help anymore. I thought that was patience. I understand now that it was something else. It was trust. Trust that the right things would eventually stand up and show themselves if you didn't rush in and explain them away. I am 67 years old, and I am still learning what my husband knew about me. I think I will spend the rest of my life at it. I think that might be exactly the right use of time. I think about Gerald's letter a lot, not the part about the money. I've mostly made peace with that, but the part where he wrote that he wanted me to be loved for who I am. He'd seen enough of the world to know that assets change people, not always into villains, but into different versions of themselves, versions that calculate. He chose to protect me from that, and the protection cost him years of carrying a secret alone. That's not nothing. That weighs on me sometimes, the quiet sacrifice of it. What happened with my son wasn't simply the story of a predatory woman who targeted the wrong family. It was also the story of a man who let himself be slowly convinced that love meant management, that caring for someone meant controlling their decisions. Celeste didn't manufacture that impulse in him out of nothing. She found a thread that was already there, some unexamined belief that his mother needed handling, and she pulled it. That's the part I've had to sit with honestly. My son is a good person who made choices that caused real harm. Both of those things are true at the same time in holding them together without collapsing one into the other. That's the actual work. What I've come to understand is that integrity isn't a quality you either have or you don't. It's something you practice or fail to practice every single day. Celeste was intelligent, organized, methodical. She had capability in abundance, but she pointed it entirely at what she could take rather than what she could build. My son had all the information he needed to stop what was happening. He knew something felt wrong. He said so himself, standing in my living room afterward. Knowing and doing are not the same thing, and that gap between what we recognize and what we're willing to act on is where most of the real damage in the world happens. The Allura property saved me practically, but what actually saved me was deciding, somewhere in those months of being seated in the 5th row and having doors closed in my face, that I was not going to become someone who shrank, that I was going to keep thinking clearly even when the people around me were betting on my confusion. Gerald used to say that the most underrated quality in a person was the refusal to be a fool about themselves. Not arrogance, just honest, clear-eyed self-knowledge. I didn't have that fully in my 60s. I built it under pressure, which is apparently how most things get built. When I spoke at that legal clinic in Hamilton, the woman who came up to me afterward said she thought she was imagining things. I know that feeling exactly. When the people who are supposed to love you most start reframing your clarity as paranoia and your independence as a burden, it takes something, a kind of quiet stubbornness, to keep trusting what you actually know. That stubbornness is not stubbornness, really. It's the decision to remain yourself when someone else has decided you'd be more useful as a different person. Luz Calloway is 67 years old and still getting started. I mean that not as a line, but as a description of how mornings feel now. Gerald was right about the strength. He just didn't tell me I'd have to earn it the hard way. I think he knew I'd find that part out on my own.